there are so many overlapping aspects of the rise of Trump, President Trump's agenda, the America First movement, the last 10 years, and the rise of the National Conservative movement. And I think some of those things that I would draw out on, number one, just the very notion of a different type of conservatism. A conservatism that is durable, a conservatism that is oriented around preserving the country. We can actually talk about nations again. We can talk about countries again. We can remember that countries have borders, that it matters the extent to which we have a conversation about who is coming into the country and are they here on legal terms. I remember in the 2017 election, Paul Ryan literally stopped the campaign on the basis of a proposal from President Trump to screen individuals from countries that have many people in their country that are engaged in activities of terrorism that we would not want to bring to this country. And Paul Ryan, in the midst of a complete conservative incorporated freakout, said this is about the definition of conservatism. He was right about that. And that is a conversation that I think that we're able to have now, that we are remembering that a nation has many things that keeps it together. It has a religious heritage in which its civic life is based on, of Judeo-Christian worldviews, and that while we may give religious liberty to everyone, that there is an importance and a foundation and a structure to our system when our declaration says that we are created equal under one God that all of our liberties flow from. Similarly, when it comes to a community, that it matters. We're not just an economy. We're not just a bunch of consumers. That while we are those things, we are also people who are parents, we're neighbors, we live in communities, and we don't want drugs all over the streets. We don't want critical race theory taught in our schools. We don't want a transgender contagion lying to our children. And these were all conversations that before the National Conservative movement and the rise of Trump, we were not able to have. And we were called names, and I'll get that in a second. So I think that first similarity between President Trump and this movement, this incredibly healthy, vibrant movement, is that definition of a conservatism that I think is an older definition, but one that is more oriented towards preserving the country and passing it on to future generations. There's a certain, and this is the second point, there's a certain toughness with this movement. Any of the things that I just talked about until recently would have gotten you called names. When I defended my faith in 2017, I had no idea that writing in defense of my college alma mater in its statement of faith would get me called a bigot when I came before the Senate, but it did. People took great offense that I defended essentially John 3:16, which is behind home plate in every baseball game. And so any of the things that I talked about, whether it's being more judicious with why we go to war, that gets you called an appeaser. That gets you called an isolationist. If you're talking about issues of faith, it gets you called a bigot. If you're talking about why we would want to possibly upend critical race theory, that would get you called a racist. And so there's a certain toughness to the National Conservative movement that I think is entirely healthy and has allowed us to enter the moment that we're in with a far better chance of success, and I think you're seeing that success. In my own interaction with President Trump, he helped teach many of us this. In 2020, we first learned about critical race theory, and I know many had been following it, people like Chris Rufo and others, but for those of us in public office, we began to hear about it for the first time. And I remember President Trump said, I want you to get rid of it in the federal government, I want you to defund it, and I did do that. And we did it on a Friday afternoon. He didn't want to wait till Tuesday. I'm thinking to myself, okay, are there going to be rioters on my lawn the next day? Are we doing on Friday? Is this going to be something where, how's this going to roll out? And the next morning I woke up and put on X, Twitter at the time, and woke up to no fewer than 20 tweets, retweets from President Trump leaning into this fight. The notion that in any way we were going to take a back seat to defending the notion that we should all be equal under the side of the law and that we're not going to have state-sanctioned races was something that was anathema to him. And he gave us an example. And you know what? That was the first time a public official had done anything like that. Anytime you threw the word racism at a public official before that moment, they would go run. And that had been a kryptonite of the right for decades. That does not exist anymore. And we saw it immediately after when people would go to school board meetings with full recognition of what they might be up against. That if they go to a school board meeting and they were called a racist, that they might meet the press, and that if you do a Google search of them, that may be with them for the rest of their life, but it did not deter them. And then we saw that move into the transgender fight as well, where you had coaches saying, I'm not going to lie to my students about the difference between a man and a woman, a boy or a girl. And that toughness, that ability to withstand the attacks of the left has been paramount. It has been the thing that they have not accounted for because it has been their strategic playbook for over 100 years. And the last thing I would say in terms of kind of these overlapping characteristics is just the notion of a clock. I didn't come up with it, but someone in this movement came up with the notion of what time is it? Do you have any idea what time is it as a country? Like our philosophical agenda doesn't have all the time in the world. There is a point of no return. That moment, it may not be 11:59. I personally believe it was pretty close to 11:59. Most in Capitol Hill would say it's 4 p.m. Their staff would say it's probably noon. But the notion of a clock, that what you are at, like what are the fights that you are picking? What are the solutions that you are coming up with? Will they actually solve the problem? And we saw this in the aftermath of Obamacare when this town, the right, gravitated to not repeal of Obamacare, but to repealing the medical device tax. And you're thinking, has that any success whatsoever in turning back the debate that we just rallied the country to? Another example is Export-Import Bank. Export-Import Bank, and thankfully President Trump took a different view of this. But the whole conservative movement incorporated, and we had, in my previous jobs, a part of this, made this the central issue of the day. You couldn't probably put it on the top 50 issues of what's necessary to save the country. So it's not just about what fights you pick, but then what is your solution to those problems? And ultimately, the Claremont guys would say this is about statesmanship, and that is true. What is the leadership and the ideas that are needed, the context for the moment that we find ourselves in? And I think that is something also that is a part of the national conservative movement, is if you care about a nation and a community and a people, then it matters the extent to which not only like you see your family and your kids, we're at a moment of precipice. And it has allowed us in the last 10 years, particularly in the last 4 to 5, to know how critical this last election was. In many respects, it was not unlike a third major pivot point in our country, 1776, 1860, and I believe the last election, because of what was on the line. What was on the line was that we had not just one existential issue, not just two existential issues, we had many, many existential issues. And all of those existential issues came through what I'm going to talk about today, which is the fact that we were up against a bureaucracy that was 100 years in the making. Some would call it the deep state, some would call it the administrative state. I would call it the woke and weaponized administrative state because of the different characteristics and aspects of it. But we are now at the point after this election where we have a president who understands fully what is in front of him and has dealt aggressively and quickly with that. Much work still remains, but we have a movement that is there to support that work. We are not reading people out of the party when they raise the issues. We are not We don't have a movement that's writing op-eds against the president for the steps that he's taking. There is great enthusiasm for what is going on. Let me unpack a little bit for how this came about. Turn of the last century, what you would have seen from the left was great angst with our Constitution. They hated the separation of powers. They wanted constitutional amendments. You would have had Woodrow Wilson writing his dissertation on congressional government. Interesting, congressional government. His view, his ideal was Britain, where you have the executive branch within Parliament with full power and the ability to move and move quickly, largely through the House of Commons and not the House of Lords, which is just a small check. That's what they have their eyes set on. And over time, they stopped writing the op-eds calling for constitutional amendments, and they chose innovation through incrementalism and institutions, never having an actual amendment, but just changing the way these institutions are oriented towards each other. They had the living constitution. So a living constitution says you don't actually have to go by the words of the Constitution or, and I'll talk about this later, the way that the Constitution is supposed to work together, the separation of powers, where there's actual conflict between the branches. They instead said, look, we're gonna change that. We're gonna over time move in a different direction. We're gonna change the way these institutions work and interact with each other. Number two, they went hard after the notion of an expert bureaucracy, where you take politics out of it. Theoretically, politics is never taken out of it. You take politics out of it, you give it to people who are there permanently, and you trust their independent advice. This also came at the same time where Congress was increasingly giving more of its power behind closed door to the executive branch to just write the laws. And this is what we largely find ourselves today. You know, when Nancy Pelosi made that famous joke, we call it a joke, but she was being serious, that you have to pass the law to see what's in it, there's a certain truth to that, which is that's how they intended it. They want bills that are passed with lawmaking authority to the executive agencies. The executive agencies would just go and do their expert opinion, and Congress would retain, not at the rank and file level, but at the leadership level and at the committee chairman and the appropriations process, they would retain the power to impact and shape those decisions behind closed doors. But notice what you don't have. You don't have a democratic debate. You don't have trade-offs being made before the American people. You don't have great debates in front of the House and the Senate. You have largely a cartel working behind closed doors, and they come once or twice a year with a mega bill, an omnibus bill, or some other must-pass bill, and they push everything into the light of day for one brief moment. That's what you got. And so that is a byproduct of being able to have a system based on these expert opinions that are largely unmovable. And we thought that for many decades, that what on earth is the solution to being able to have individuals that are not being able to come in with an administration and are largely entrenched. And third, the whole notion of the appropriations process and spending has been reformed and moved in the opposite direction to give Congress much more of the power than the executive branch. And this really picked up in the 1970s, where you took 200 years of presidents who had the ability to spend less than the congressional appropriated ceiling, which is a major constitutional principle. We would never view that Congress doesn't have the power of the purse, but the executive has the power to spend. And this was built on the foundation of what we learned and brought from the principles of the UK. And that was an important notion, that Congress sets that ceiling and presidents have the ability to spend less if they think it's important to prevent waste and abuse. And literally 200 years of presidents did this, from George Washington up until Richard Nixon. At the lowest moment of the presidency, and we now know of the post-Watergate phenomena, at the lowest moment of the presidency, what do we have? We have the Impoundment Control Act that upends and says it is no longer a ceiling, it is a floor. You have to push all the money out the door. And that now orients the bureaucracy, who now have career civil service protections to orient not from the President of the United States, but to the Congress that controls their purse strings. And so we have a fundamentally different system. In some respects, it is a revolution that occurred over the last 100 years. The last one I would just say, the last thing that was a very, very important development was the notion of an independent agency. The founders would not have any notion of what an independent agency is. All executive power is vested in the executive branch. It's pretty simple. There are 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. And yet, over time, the notion of independent agencies, an alphabet of soup, where sometimes Congress would say, look, we are intending this to be independent. Okay, we're going to have a debate and Supreme Court decisions on whether that is something that would have the founders would have understood. But there's also this development, even with agencies like mine. Statistician. Why is statistician an independent portfolio with an OMB? It no longer is. You saw this Department of Justice. Department of Justice had the notion in the post-Watergate consensus that we're fundamentally different and independent of the president's law enforcement capabilities. And so those 4 developments over the last 100 years has created, heading into this election, this woke and weaponized bureaucracy. And I should say at the end, well, why do I call it woke and weaponized? Because what had been forming for many, many decades and really was very big, authoritative, and a waste of taxpayer money, really in the last 10 years under Obama and Biden had a new feature, and that it was woke. The bureaucrats that you would find would be attempting to divide the country on the basis of race and identity, most of the time. And they were newly weaponized. They were aimed at the very American people that they were sent to keep secure and to protect. And that's not just the Department of Justice, which we know well about, but that would be at the EPA that would put a 70-year-old Navy veteran in jail for building ponds on his ranch to fight wildfires, or the Department of Labor, who went after a woman who was providing discounts to poor women to come into her shop, a consignment shop, and give out and put labels on them so that they could get discounts for their kids. Every agency, Interior, denying Drake's Oyster Farm a license that they had enjoyed for decades. Every agency woke and weaponized. And so for those of us who have had eyes and ears to hear, this is what we have been up against in the magnitude of this last election. Thankfully, President Trump won. He won in a convincing fashion, and we have now been embarked on deconstructing this administrative state. And we have done it largely in the same spots that I have just mentioned. So instead of being overly concerned with what the post-Watergate consensus in this town has been, the president has tried to have the view of what would the founders have thought. And not just from kind of a Federalist Society originalist perspective where you just go off of the latest court precedent and you interpret the words as the founders would have interpreted. And that's all very, very good and important. But to go beyond that and say, how would the founders have actually operated in this, given the facts that we are given the situation? How would they have responded branch on branch to be able to ensure that our liberties are protected? And that is a fundamentally different way of doing it. And I think you've seen that with regard to the aggressiveness that the president and his administration has gone at this problem, the way we have tried to go quickly. If Congress has given us authority that is too broad, then we're going to use that authority aggressively to protect the American people, and then we can have a debate about what those reforms statutorily should look permanently. We're not going to just be sitting back waiting on you to pass 100 days of legislations that maybe you pass one and you don't get to the rest. Thankfully, we put as many as we possibly could in the one big beautiful bill, and I think that will pay dividends. But step after step, it's to move quickly, trying to think through what would the founders have done in this circumstance, and then be aggressive and not let this town define the art of politically possible. Secondly, we've gone rethought of the notion of independence. There are no independent agencies. The president and the administration has done everything from bring independent agencies, regulations in for review at my office, Office of Management and Budget, including the Fed, where their policy regulations are coming through. We have taken great steps to make sure that we are bringing those in for the type of policy conversation that is incumbent when a president is elected and represents the views of the American people. On spending, and this is in the news this week and last week, we have defended the notion and dusted off the notion of impoundment, the notion that you can spend less than the congressional appropriation, that's important, that in and of itself will make it so that we have budgets again that are not ignored. The president's budget was started to be ignored when, in the 1970s, when impoundment largely went away. Notice it wasn't called the Impoundment Prevention Act. It was called the Impoundment Control Act. Even then, Congress knew that they didn't have the right to take this power away from the president. And so we've been very clear that, yes, we are going to go and look for opportunities to have Congress vote on rescissions and DOGE cuts. We actually had the first rescissions passage that was since 1998. That was done earlier this year, and it was a great victory. For the first time, we defunded Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Fantastic. But we're also not going to take off the table unilateral moves that the president can do to spend less. And you see that working out its way right now, as last week we put forward the first pocket rescission since the 1970s. Interestingly, Jimmy Carter did it, Gerald Ford did it, the GAO. We're not big fans of GAO. They are a quasi-legislative independent entity. Again, something that shouldn't exist. But we put that up last week, and we're having a debate on it. It does not need a vote in Congress to have that money at the end of the 45 days just evaporate. So it's very, very important. So all of these critical areas where the left moved decisively over time to create a woke and weaponized bureaucracy, we are moving decisively in the opposite direction to be able to restore this country to what it was meant to be, to restore freedom to this country, to ensure that the country doesn't have a government that hates half of the population, that in fact is designed to make sure that the people are protected, that their interests are able to be to flourish, that they can have happiness in their communities, that they can go and think about something other than politics, that they can be involved in their church, that they can build a small business, and occasionally tune in to what's going on in their state and local and national government capital, and instead of being outraged, instead of not trusting them, can over time begin to think, man, this is actually designed for my good. Because I think that is another aspect of the national conservative movement, which is that a government is meant for something. We do need governments. We are not anarchists. We do need governments to do certain things, but they have certain roles that they should be kept in, and that is important. So there's so much being done right now. I know everyone is very enthusiastic. I'm enthusiastic about it. It's fun to be a part of. People say, are you hating the long hours? No. On what planet would you hate the opportunity to be a part of what is going on, to work closely with the president, to absorb his ideas? He is an incredible person and leader when you have an opportunity to see him up close and personal and see how he is responding to events and thinking of things that we've never come up with. And then to also marry that with having done the job before. The president's done this job. He's thought about it for 4 years, and we're going as fast as we possibly can to make success. And we will continue to that. But what I want to leave you with is that don't think that we have won the intellectual war. Don't think that the minute that the president is out of office and this town doesn't have to deal with the immense the immense power of his personality, his ideas, his connection to the American people, his voters, that this town, and not just the K Street crowd, but the think tank community that exists here, will not try to pivot back to the form of conservatism that I believe that national conservatism is a response to the caricatures of that movement. There will be a conversation, and it will be an aggressive conversation. And so while we need, at this moment in time, all of the enthusiasm for the work being done in the administration to support us, to give us ideas, to help us make the case for it, because we're largely giving people a wider angle lens of what this country used to be about, what its leaders used to care about. While we do that, also be building the institutions of the movement. We need more think tanks. We need more journals. We need more opinion columnists that are going to be doing the work of national conservatism to ensure that this is a durable event and that the movement that President Trump has been a part of, that the national conservative movement has been a part of, isn't just an unhealthy stream built around the personality of one person and their ability to win elections, but it is in fact a durable intellectual river that becomes a flood that cuts through the work of saving this country. The last thing I would just leave you with was just an image, and it's an image that we've used before, but that is, if you look at a tree and cement is around it, often over time you can notice that a strong oak tree can break up the cement around it through the strong root systems. The problems of the modern world, what we're up against as the national conservative movement, seems so insurmountable. But as you have, it's a labor just to figure out the cross currents, to be able to recognize reality. Whitaker Chambers would say to get height. That itself is hard enough. But then when you know what's wrong and what's off and what needs to be fixed, then to figure out what must be done can be very, very discouraging until you realize that a strong institution is not unlike an oak tree. A strong movement is not unlike a strong oak tree, that as it grows, as it flourishes, it will break up the seemingly unsurpassable strength of the concrete around it. And I think that is what we have to look forward to in the future. We're in the midst of, in the words of Rudyard Kipling right now, filling the unforgiving moment with 60 seconds worth of distance run. We will be doing that for the next 4 years. And that is important work. But keep building this movement, keep writing, keep leading, because it will be, over time, the things that saves our country. Thanks for inviting me. Appreciate it.